Edinburgh last year in summer. And the reason I was there was to actually study the four skulls of Taiwanese indigenous communities. Now, Taiwan, also called Taiwanzu, right? The four skulls, eventually in November, they return to Taiwan from Edinburgh after nearly 150 years. And so I will let you watch a video first, and it's about 3 minutes.
A traditional cleansing ceremony to mark the return of four warrior skulls taken 150 years ago during a Japanese invasion of Taiwan. The warriors were from the Paiwan, one of Taiwan's largest indigenous groups, and it was an emotional homecoming for the community.
内心的感动真的突然被人打劫了。
尤其看到有一颗是很年轻的头颅，其实对我们来讲都很锥心的痛。对，在那场战役有这么年轻的族人都要参与这个战役的部分，其实对我们来讲心里是非常的痛。
The skulls of the Paiwan's ancestors were taken by Japan in a conflict that had wider historical significance for Taiwan. In 1874, Japan invaded southern Taiwan in what it said was a mission to avenge the killings of dozens of shipwrecked sailors from present-day Okinawa by members of the Paiwan. But scholars say Japan used that as an excuse and a stepping stone for its eventual occupation and colonization of Taiwan. The skulls are thought to have been taken as war trophies, carried to Japan by a US Navy officer who was acting as a military advisor. Later, the skulls were taken to the US and finally given to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in 1907, by which time Taiwan was a Japanese colony. Edinburgh has now given them back, saying it has been working to return items to representatives of the cultures from which they were taken. But the Paiwan community in Mudan Township did not initially welcome the idea of their returning ancestors.
因为认为他们并不是像一般人寿终正寝的，但是后来在祖灵的引导及沟通之下，确实他是为了部落去牺牲自己的性命，所以我们才会慎重的去迎接他们回来。
According to tradition, the skulls can't be seen in public until various rituals have taken place. For now, they will be kept in this museum, about a 3-hour drive from where the original battle took place, where they will undergo testing before being moved to a permanent resting place. And this time, it will be up to the indigenous community themselves to decide what happens to them. Devon Tsai and Louise Watt for Taiwan Plus.
Okay. Right, so these skulls were believed to be removed from Taiwan warriors who actually fought fiercely in the so-called the Bolton incident. And this was the first overseas battle started by Japanese during the Meiji period against indigenous communities in the very southern part of Taiwan. Now, if you travel to Taiwan, and it's a very popular beach resort, Kending, right? It's close to Kending, right? And in some, well, actually, most people know that this incident was Bolton incident, 牡丹事件. What was that then? Actually, there were two records. The first was actually 1871 in November. 54 Ryukyu people from Okinawa, they were massacred. They actually drifted to Taiwan, and they were massacred by Taiwan indigenous people, right, in Bolton area. And then, in 3 years, in the name of punishing these murderers, Japanese army invaded Taiwan in 1874 in April, and it provoked very fierce battles between the indigenous people and Japanese, and this is so-called the Bolton tribe incident in Taiwan history. Right? And this, well, if you go to Okinawa near Naha, you can see this plaque that was raised to commemorate those who were killed, Okinawa community people killed in Taiwan on the left. And if you come to Taiwan, in the southern part of Taiwan near Kending, you see another memorial to commemorate those who, actually Taiwanese indigenous people who were killed in the incidents. There are several other memorials like this, right, in Japan and in Taiwan. And this incident eventually became the tipping point for Japan to colonize Taiwan, although the theory is still controversial, right? And over 1.5 centuries, these four skulls not only witnessed the brutal fight between nations, but also a painstaking development of human sciences that was shaped by scientists to determine the characteristics of different ethnicities, or in older term, we call it race. Right, it's quite interesting that when these four skulls arrived in Taiwan last year, they had to go through genetic testing. And so far, we haven't really, the result haven't been really revealed to the public. And the reason why that they need to go through the test was because just like what was said in the video, that the four skulls were not initially welcomed. They were not sure. First, these people died from misfortune instead of that they were like like they died on the battlefield with pride, right? So well, and then after 150 years ago, some people in Taiwan, within the indigenous community, that they did not know whether or not these four skulls belonged to their ancestors. So it is the genetic profile that they need to know in order to learn whether or not they belong to the same community or same family. Okay, right. And but today I'm going to talk about an older science, physical anthropology. These sciences, they were predominantly derived uh, from racialized science that was popular in the 19th century, actually 18th and 19th century. Whether or not they were scientifically sound or not, they were very critical in forming theories and practices of racial classification and stratification. Okay, so what is physical anthropology then? These are 5 simple points. It is a study of human biology. So scientists, they examine the biological aspects of humans. Nowadays, genetics, right? But before, well, when genetic science was not developed, it was the morphology that was more important. So anatomy was the point. And so it emphasizes the evolutionary perspective. It focuses on human evolution, right? That was influenced, of course, in the 19th century, the long 19th century, by Charles Darwin, right? And it traces the development of humans and then ancestors over time. And it talks about the variation and adaptation. So scientists will investigate the diversity among human populations and how they adapt to different environments, right? And it was important that scientists were interested in physical anthropology at the point when this was actually towards the end of 19th century, when when criminology became very popular and important after so-called industrial revolution, right? So it's got some kind of forensic application. So scientists will utilize forensic anthropology to identify human remains and provide information for all the demographic data, age, sex, ancestry, the family trees, and cause of death, and most importantly. And it is nowadays an interdisciplinary field. So it's not only anatomists who are interested in it. From the very beginning, not only biologists, anatomists, archaeologists, and even some other people who actually belong to other disciplines that you cannot imagine at all, they're all very interested in developing science. Okay, right. And so this is physical anthropology. Now, to put it simply, there are two parts of the method of physical anthropology. First is to measure human remains. That means to remain body parts, mostly bones, after people died. Okay. And second is to measure living people, right? You weigh their weight and you measure their height and all the proportions of different body parts, lengths, widths, etc., etc. And then we're judging from all these data collected from human beings, sometimes individually or collectively, you determine the quality, the characteristics of this person or this community, right? So there are two methods of doing physical anthropology. Now, in a paper, now this is very interesting. The 4 Bolton skulls were documented in different scientific papers, and the most important report was this one, William Turner's report. William Turner was a professor of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh, and he compared the 4 skulls with those other skulls from Malaysia. So in his paper, the Borneo area in Malay archipelagos, and from Tibet. So in this paper, the William Turner that he compared skulls of Formosans, Tibetans, and Malayans, right? And before Turner's study, it was the US surgeon Stuart Eldridge that was mentioned actually in the video I just showed, that Stuart Eldridge was a Navy officer from the United States, and he worked in Japan, in Yokohama area. He wrote a pamphlet, right? Actually, he presented his finding about the 4 skulls first in a society, the Asian Anthropological Society. He says, quote, right, Boltons are a race of rather fine physical development, medium height, courageous, frank, and impressible, like most savages. Look, savages, the term he used. Straight hair, complexion varies, but always brown tint, never black, right? So all these descriptions have certain implications. Now, in the museum catalog, the 4 skulls were assigned to Japan, right? So that means these 4 skulls belong to Japanese, okay? Right? The Japanese empire sought at the time to create an all-encompassing Japanese so-called minzoku, right? But William Turner himself, in his report, he described the 4 skulls as, now I'm going to read this, were those of man, the prime of time. They were so closely approaching each other in absolute dimensions and general form that they exhibited a strong racial or even family resemblance, right? End of quote. So, with carefully calculated data obtained from measuring almost all parts of the 4 skulls, if you want to read the report, it's available online, right? And you can actually download it from the Wellcome Collection online catalog. This is a museum, medical museum based in London, right? He suggested that these Boltons were close to Malayo-Philippine type of race. Okay, and so there are some important points emphasized by Turner. The faces of these skulls are not flattened, and there were no clues about them being Negrotos, right? If their faces are flattened, that means that they belong to certain kind of race that was already quite well studied, which is a kind of an inferior kind of race, right? That was found in Southeast Asia, also by Japanese scientists. And at that time, there were actually a lot of documentations about Negrotos. These are short stature people, right? And they were intended, I mean, scientists, they found when they saw these 4 skulls, they were intended to study, to prove whether or not these skulls are kind of slaughtered, harvested from people of short statures. right? If they belong to these people with short statures, that means that they were close to Neanderthals. Nowadays, were very popular. That the scientists were trying to look for these people of this kind of figures, and these people were also inferior kind of race. Okay, so clearly there was implication about this report. It is about the superiority, right? Scientists, they were looking for clues to prove that kind of superiority and to really to place uh, to to determine the hierarchy of different ethnicities, right? Okay, so these are just four skulls, right? And the study of skulls in the 19th century was very close to a kind of science that was also very popular, phrenology, right? What was phrenology then? It was a science of mind. Now it was nowadays debunked as a pseudoscience because the theory claims that personality traits and mental abilities can be determined by the shape and size of the skulls. So there was a very important and famous method to really measure the superiority or inferiority of human beings. Is that you pour you pour stones and sands into a skulls and measure the weight. Okay, and in Taiwan, it's quite interesting that in this is after 1920 when anatomists were when they were measuring the skulls, they used a kind of seeds that was easily available in Taiwan instead of stones. Okay, right. So there are different methods evolved from the same theory and practice. And it was popular in the 19th century. It was founded by Franz Joseph Gall, a Viennese phrenologist that he gained popularity during the 1800s. And it's as a way to understand behavior and personality. And based on cranial bumps, right? What is cranial bumps then? So all these bumps that are protruding elements on your face, okay? So the scientists will believe that specific areas of the brain can be corresponding to different faculties of the traits. And there, for example, that if you have bad temper, that because some of these bumps are more obvious on your face, on your skull, right? And so this kind of theory, it was nowadays proved lacked scientific validity, and it was criticized for the lack of empirical evidence and flawed methodology. Perhaps we can say that, but if you look at all the reports scientists they produced in the 19th century, you still can see the very careful measurement, very careful and detailed measurement, right? So nowadays, nowadays we call it a pseudoscience, in the 19th century, people would genuinely believe they will believe the quality that it is a sound science. Okay. And in the 19th century, uh, with the with the largest medical school existing in Britain, Edinburgh University, that it housed the largest medical school in the United Kingdom. And so it became a hub for many different schools of medical knowledge, including, of course, phrenology and physical anthropology. And the city, Edinburgh, it enjoyed the outcome of Scottish Enlightenment from the 16th, no, from the 15th centuries onwards. Okay, so making it a gathering and distributing center for scientific and philosophical discussion. And at the beginning of the 19th century, Johannes Brutheim, that this is a very famous, the chief propagator of phrenology, that he already lectured at Edinburgh University. Okay, he was from Germany. And this person, George Combe, he was even more important than nowadays. I just said that phrenology or physical anthropology is an interdisciplinary study, right? And this person was not even an anatomist. He was not even a biologist. He was a lawyer, okay? And he played a crucial role in promoting phrenology, right? And so he founded the Edinburgh Phrenological Society in the year 1820. Okay. And so it is actually not surprising to see the development of anatomy, neurology, psychology, all these important medical disciplines. They were heavily influenced by phrenology, right? And although nowadays that the science is debunked as oversimplified and sometimes inaccurate. Okay. And what fascinating about William Turner's report just now I showed is not the science that was popular already at the time. All the racialized implications carried along the paper were not new at all. Okay. So instead it was the way that he managed to source the human specimens, the way these skulls traveled from Taiwan to Japan and then to Britain, when the theories and practices of physical anthropology gained significant attention and impact. So it blending the city's intellectual landscape during the period of burgeoning curious exploration among scientists worldwide in his time. Now, I'm going to show you another video. What is craniometry? Craniometry is also, we can say that this is a type of physical anthropology, and it is a more scientific way of practicing phrenology. Just now I say there was a lot of very detailed, very careful measurement, right? And so this is when in the 19th century, when people regarded that our minds are closely connected to the shape of the structure of our head, right? So in this science, people actually emphasize the materiality of human's mind. Okay, so I'm going to show you this video, only 2 minutes.
Phrenology broadly is the belief that the mind is divided into organs. I guess that's the main metaphor. That organ is also material, like the other organs in your body, and different bits of the material mind do different things. So it's a materialist philosophy of the mind with some brain localization built in. So you're supposed to be able to follow the contours of the skull, and that perfectly maps the contours of the brain. The problem is that's not true. Or at least it's not true everywhere on your head. People at the time argued about whether that is the case or not. That controversy gets to the heart of the social and political controversy at the time, because if you think the brain and the skull are in tandem, then it means basically anyone can pronounce on the mind. Phrenology, which is supposed to be the classic pseudoscience, the term pseudoscience is coined to describe it in the 1830s. Didn't go away, it just got absorbed into mainstream scientific and popular understandings of the brain.
Okay, so from the closing period of the 18th century, okay, physical anthropology, including craniology, including phrenology, right? It became very important for scientists to determine the quality of race. And it was developed along the expansion of so-called the Euro-American empires, okay? And then, now entering the very long 19th century, phrenology especially served as the basic foundation to predict individuals and different communities' mental capacity. And it stimulated the growth of criminology globally. And according to this historian who was speaking in the video, James Poskett, it was the materiality of the mind and international communication networks that facilitated the expansion of such knowledge. So, along the development of craniology and phrenology, which measures the skulls and the head and heads of living people, not only dead, but also living people, this highly racialized science was employed to serve various political ends, right? predominantly associated with the abolition of slavery in Euro-American contexts, right? And so this is actually a science that was, well, in his book, look, that the time frame was 1815 to 1920. But actually, that kind of practice did not stop there. It did not stop there, right? Now, what about East Asia? Just now, that was Euro-American context. What about East Asia then? In the first half of the 20th century, especially so-called, uh, no, I mean, how did these theories and practices of measuring body parts travel to East Asia, including measuring the skulls? And how was it received and appropriated in the Japanese Empire? And scientists that worked under the Japanese Empire, they also tried to develop sciences, right, to justify all these theories that are needed for colonial expansion, okay? And quite different from Euro-American empires. Japan, it aimed to create a sphere of influence in neighboring regions. For example, okay, in the 19th, in the end of 19th century, like Korea, right, Manchuria, different parts, different free ports in China, Shanghai, Tianjin, Guangdong, Hong Kong, right? They aiming really to create what they term the so-called the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And this expansion was justified with the concept of promoting Pan-Asianism, which aims to liberate Asia from Western dominance. And in this context, what role did this science that is highly, highly racialized, this science play when it was used to serve the exceptional concept of Japanese minzoku? Then, so these are the very interesting questions I'm going to explore, right? After, for example, like imperial universities were established in the late 1920s, how did such science evolve in comparison with all those other applications in Europe then? What is interesting is that survey sciences and physical anthropology was also developed in the colonial period. Right? The development of physical anthropology was based on two foundations. In Taiwan, under Japanese colonial rules, first, it was numeric rationale, advanced with survey sciences. The survey sciences they were conducted for the purpose of colonization, and it became the groundwork for different kinds of measurement. Okay, body measurement, well, collecting as well, observation, collection, and measurement, right? And secondly, it was the medical sciences that was established for the Japanese scientists in order to improve the hygienic condition in Taiwan. That became important. So the modern medicine was another pillar, another foundation of such of physical anthropology. And now, who were actually practicing physical anthropologists then? They were anatomists, right? Uh, so for example, in Taiwan, in the first decade of the 20th century, the surveying work that was matured along the expansion of colonial industries, they rely on the work of anthropologists who actually went out from their laboratories and conduct field works, right? And so they use very exhaustive type of measure, and that means they measure nearly everything and all the elements on nearly everything. That kind of exhaustive type of measurement that was used by the anthropologists. They became very powerful tools for human sciences to develop physical anthropology. In Taiwan, the foundation of physical anthropology was laid by this person on the right, right? His name is Kanaseki Takeo, right? He was born in 1897. And 2 years after he arrived in after he was, 2 years after Taiwan was colonized by Japan, he was born, right? And in addition to medicine, it's quite interestingly, he was not only a medical doctor, He was also interested in cultural anthropology, folk studies, and archaeology. For example, that he established this magazine, the Minzoku Taiwan, right? Uh, and and what interesting about human sciences that were developed in East Asia, it carried a characteristic human sciences in Euro-American context, which was field work. That is very important element. You go out from your laboratory and you measure everything on the ground you can see. In Germany, for example, because I'm a medical historian or historian of predominantly mental health, right? And in the field of mental health, in the field of psychiatry, Germany, it was also an empire, right? But actually scientists, they think in their laboratories. They do not go out, right? And now in Japan, this is something different. And there's a historian, her name is Miriam Kadia, that he emphasized that fieldwork embarked by Japanese anthropologists in the colonies, like in Korea. Her research was in Korea. It was critical to the encroachment of human sciences during trans-war Japan. And I have another research. I emphasize on the fact that statistics were also very important, was also a discipline that made survey sciences unique in Japan's colonies. And this was due partially to the maturation of statistical sciences in the first decades in the 20th century in the Japanese Empire. There was a huge debate. Right. So now in the 1920s, very different from Europe, measuring body parts in colonial Taiwan did not only emphasize on skulls, but also other body parts. I'm going to explain later. The materiality of the mind was no longer popular. From the 19th century, from the 1920s on, if you want to study humans' mentality or mental capacity, it was the behavioral science, psychological testing that became very important. Okay? And in Japanese colonized Taiwan, although the fact that body measurements led many traces of previous racial sciences, this kind of scientific practice, it became largely based on ethnic divisions. The function of racial classification in this science is unlike in William Turner's report to determine the hierarchy of different races. So in this part of the world, in the Japanese Empire, it was purely the classification that is important. And the classification served as an important concept for the Japanese Empire to create so-called the Japanese Minzoku. The Minzoku, it is a one Minzoku, but it has a lot of different classifications. There were no hierarchy there. Okay. And this is according to another historian, he's from France, Arnaud Nanta. The Japanese Empire, the anthropometry, right, of the Japanese Empire differed from European physical anthropology in a way that it did not aim to establish the hierarchy of races based on physical characteristics. He emphasized on Korea, actually colonial Korea. So he found that scientists were interested in classifying different races under the concept of Japanese Minzoku. And in many scientific reports, we can see scientists, they're judging the strength and weakness of different ethnic groups, but we also see their solutions for how to build up a physical strength of which groups, right? Now we're going to talk about how in Europe or in Taiwan, how do people treat these people of different traits in their body structure, right? Now, the most interesting part is this, okay? The travelogue of 4 Bolton skulls, right? The journey of these 4 Bolton skulls, they came from the southernmost point of Taiwan to Scotland, it bears to a 1.5 century journey of global scientific knowledge construction about race. This journey was not linear. This was crooked, it's zigzag, right? It's not just from east to west, right? And according to William Turner, these 4 indigenous skulls from Formosa was presented to him by John Anderson. Okay, so William Turner is this person on the far left. John Anderson is the second. He was a Scottish zoologist. Okay, and then now let's map out the various processes of the 4 skulls. Right. First, it was after the second Bolton incident, the skulls were fell into the hands of Stuart Eldridge. Just now we mentioned about him he's a U.S. Navy officer, worked in Yokohama, right? And then John Anderson, the Scottish zoologist. But there was another third person. I think that he was quite critical, and it was not documented in the papers available nowadays. His name is John Anderson, right? And no, his name is William Watson, right? He was a U.S. military officer, and he first went to Japan as the secretary of the U.S. diplomatic legation, and then he worked as a surveyor. Look, surveying science was important, right? In the Japanese business of colonialism, right? So he worked as a surveyor for a school in Hokkaido, and then he became a worker of Hokkaido colonization office. And then during the Taiwan expedition, well, he said Taiwan expedition, that means that led to the so-called the Bolton incident, right, in 1874. He was commissioned as a colonel of engineers in the Imperial Japanese Army. The reason why he was appointed is for the Japanese Empire to check if Taiwan was a suitable place for colonization. Okay, so these 4 skulls were actually kind of transferred in different people's possession through this worldwide map. Now, it is not surprising that after the 4 Bolton warriors were killed, their skulls were taken back to Japan as trophies of the battle. This practice was very, very common in the 19th century. And this is in another historian a book. He wrote a book called Bone Rooms. In the 19th century, along the development of physical anthropology, medical professionals and scientists whose research focused on race for collectors of human remains, at least in America. And the collectors and curators of these bone rooms undertook a global search for remains to answer their queries. So they were curious about different ethnicities. At that time, the term was race. And they actually went out to collect these so-called specimens. So victims at various wars became the sources for these bone specimens, including skulls and skeletons. In Japan, the expeditions carried out along the expansion of colonies also served as important origin scientists to source human body parts as study subjects. Okay? Now, this is another historian, Morris Law, that he studied Ainu. He said, the establishment of Japan as a modern nation state in the late 19th century saw the colonization of Northern Ireland, where the Ainu people largely resided, and remaining of it as Hokkaido from 1969. So in Hokkaido, there was when Hokkaido became a colony, right, there were important survey works going on that was commenced, and there were scientists, for example, there were anatomists, archaeologists. They became key figures to study the development of physical anthropology in Japan. So physical anthropology in Japan was started from these scientists who worked in the colonial Hokkaido. Okay, so there are several famous became important. For example, like Nigagawa Noranate, an American zoologist, Edward Morris. They became very important. Now, however, that according also to Morris law, when Japanese empire was creating so-called the Japanese Minsoku, right, in the 19th century, no, in the 20th century, and then almost during the trans-war period, that these studies were almost forgotten, right? Why was that? Because they belong already to the Japanese Minsoku, okay? And then so see, Ainu people's indigenous status was not really recognized until very, very recently, right? Now, let's look at, this is something very interesting. Anthropologists, they have studied the exchange behaviors from prehistoric to modern times, so-called the gifting culture. So as a human being, we exchange things as gift, right? This is not only among people who were studied by anthropologists. The gifting behavior, exchanging objects, the behavior they also existed among anthropologists themselves. That means people are giving things away and they take things from other anthropologists. That is why these four people, they were so interested in giving specimens they are interested in to each other. Okay? Right. So it is common, not only anthropologists from the period of natural history, right? So natural historians and anthropologists, they exchange specimens, right? Either sporadically or in collection as gifts. And so in this study, the more information are needed to clarify how the four Bolton skulls were transferred among specific scientists in detail. But it is noteworthy that the study trips made by scientists, they were also very important ways for knowledge collection, construction. For example, the Scottish zoologist, just now in one of the four people who possessed the skulls, John Anderson, he was also born in Edinburgh. He graduated in medicine at the University of Edinburgh and lectured as a chair of natural history, right, in a college. And in 1864, he moved to Calcutta in India, becoming the curator of the Indian Museum in the next year. And in 1884, 10 years after the Bolton incident, he traveled through different islands in Southeast Asia, including Singapore, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and then he arrived in Japan. Finally, he arrived in Hokkaido, right? He had a very interesting travelogue that was published called Japan from India, Letters, Notes, and Journeys of Two Travelers, chiefly by one of them. And this pamphlet was published in 1884. When scientists traveled, they often carried with them large collections of animal and human specimens and artifacts collected, sourced on their journey, right? So I highly suspect that the four skulls, Bolton skulls, was sourced when they traveled to Hokkaido in 1884. That was presented by James Watson, who worked as a surveyor for the Hokkaido Colonial Office. And then he brought them, I don't know whether or not through India, but then when he returned to the UK, he presented these skulls to a friend of his who eventually became an anatomy professor at Edinburgh, William Turner. So now this map is complete. Let's look at John Anderson, what he was doing. He's a keeper of the National Museum of, no, according to according to a historical record written by the National Museum of Scotland. Her name is Jane Wilkinson. Now in Edinburgh, the museum, the largest museum now in Edinburgh is called Scottish National Museum. all the collections there about Ainu, they were contributed by John Anderson and another person called Neil Gordon Munro. And in this document, these collections reflect the interest of two contributors, right? And Munro was one of them. I'm not going to talk about him. John Anderson is interesting. Look, when he arrived in Edinburgh, look at all these atlas he drew along his journey, observing all the human, non-human specimens in detailed anatomical sketches. Look, these animal atlas, they were just like anatomy atlas, right? Because he was trained in medicine. Okay, now when we now these four Bolton skulls fell into the hands of William Turner, right? And when he was writing the report, right, he relied on Robert Swinhoe and George Leslie Mackay's accounts. Robert Swinhoe, he was a famous person in Taiwan. He worked for the British Consulate, right? He was a natural historian, right? Although he was an officer, but also he was also a natural historian. He was the first person in Taiwan to collect animals and plant specimens, and systematically, he published checklists of local species. And now this person on the right, his name is George Leslie Mackay. He was not a natural historian at all, but actually he was a missionary who was interested in dentistry, who pulled people's teeth actually as a practice to disseminate good tidings, right, of Jesus, right? But he was also a great observer of a natural environment in Taiwan. So he published a lot of books documenting a lot of also animal and plant species, and also not only that, but also minerals. Okay, so he was a Canadian he belonged to the Canadian Presbyterian Church, and he became a very important person in Taiwanese in education, medical development, medical service, right, and religion, right, in Taiwan. So look, William Turner, he also relied on a lot of information contributed by other people who were not scientists at all. Right? Now, beyond 1920s, I'm going to do it free form. Just now, I read a lot of notes I written down, right? And so what about after 1920s? How did physical anthropology evolve in Taiwan then? Right? I just said that in order to determine the mental capacity of human beings, before 1920s, there was this trend that people see that the mind was a kind of material. It was a materiality that that makes scientists to think that the mentality is closely linked to the structure of our skulls, right? But after 1920s, when anatomy became more popular, when deep sciences, or when you want to understand human bodies, you need to open up human bodies, right? So people no longer see the shape of our skulls are the most important things. Phrenology had already become unimportant. But physical anthropology still existed. But in what way then, right? In order to understand the mentality of human beings, there were psychological testing, behavioral sciences. They are available, right? But now, okay, in Taiwan, statistics and human and behaviors are more important in order to determine the mentality of these people on the colony, right? In Taiwan, just now we say physical anthropology was one thing. Now phrenology became unpopular, and now field work became important. And then the third element is this statistics, right? And there was a huge debate about statistical method in Japan in the 1920s, right? 1910s, 1920s. And there was the debate was initiated by these two people Bunso, and this another person, Mori Ogai, right, who was a diplomat, a scientist, and also a great writer, a novel writer. Very important. And Bunso's brother, Shuso, right? He was the first psychiatrist who went to Taiwan to conduct a survey of mental disorders that was asked by the the colonial office of Taiwan, right? So in 1910, he went to central Taiwan with 2 assistants for 3 months to conduct a survey on mental disorder. Look, this is 1910. This is 1910 when, see, when phrenology was still somewhat important, okay? And he actually did not observe a lot of mental disorders there. Instead, he found that there were some people of short statures among one indigenous group. This is the only finding that he wrote down in his travel report. The only finding. But then now I said, now in the 1930, that is, things are very different. In Taiwan, all these different anatomy, psychology, psychiatry, they were all institutionalized under the framework of the imperial universities. Now, in the 1930s, there was this Taihoku Imperial University. It was established. Now, using statistics, they conducted surveys island-wide, and to really measure people's behavior. Right? So this was the first psychiatric epidemiology in Taiwan. And not only in Taiwan, but at that time, Taiwan was already serving as the foundation, as a base for the Japanese Empire to embark on other survey missions in Southeast Asia. So recently, there was a historian called Seiji Shirain. He said that Taiwan was a gateway for the Japanese for the expansion of the Japanese Empire, right? So it's quite interesting that psychiatrists who worked at the Taihoku Imperial University, they also went on conducting different surveys in different Southeast Asian islands, right? For the purpose of creating the so-called Great East Asian prosperity sphere. And in the 1920s, this is from the 1920s, actually more precisely 1928, okay? 1928, the Laboratory of Physical Anthropology was established in Taiwan, and they used one textbook that was written by a German-Swiss anthropologist. His name is Rudolf Martin, right? And this is a very interesting book that it collected a lot of data, a lot of case studies worldwide, right? And the book did not really emphasize on, this is already in 1928, okay? And that it did not really emphasize on racial hierarchy, but just different types of bodies, features, characteristics. So the book also only emphasized on the classification of different ethnicities rather than racial hierarchy, right? And you can see that a lot of data from Taiwan that was provided by Ino Kanori, another important anthropologist who actually conducted different surveys in the 1910s in Taiwan, right? And these physical anthropologists in Taiwan, they rely on this textbook to produce their scientific reports from 1920s to 1950s and 60s. This was the only source that provides study methods for them to do research, right? And what is interesting is that, see, in Taiwan, that for physical anthropologists, they no longer emphasize on the superiority and inferiority of human races. Instead, in Europe, this is something unthinkable that was happened, right? Physical anthropology, it became the foundation for a human tragedy, right? During the wartime, in Japan, the Japanese Empire wanted to create a single human race, Japanese Minsoku. But in Germany, Nazi ideology was influenced by eugenics, was also a pseudoscience to improve. At that time, they believed that it was the genetic quality of a human population by selective breeding. And the Nazis, they advocated for the nation of a pure Aryan race. And then this kind of race was pursued to eliminate what they considered as undesirable elements, undesirable characteristics, all right, from a genetic pool. So these scientific theories are not scientifically sound. And so they categorize people based on perceived racial hierarchies. That means the racial hierarchies were just purely perceived. It was not scientifically studied, right? And then under the Nuremberg Law that was implemented in 1935, there was a combination of racial ideologies to aim at institutionalizing racial segregation and discrimination against, you know who they are, Jewish people in Germany, right? And so they kind of resorted to they used racial science to justify the atrocities they embarked as the Nazi propaganda, right? They use racial science to dehumanize Jews and other targeted groups, not only Jews, but also, for example, single person, homosexual people, right? And they, for example, like Jewish people were depicted as a racially inferior and a threat to so-called the superior Aryan race. So they resort to this final solution. What is final solution then, right? So at the time, the Jewish scientists that they say that there was a Jewish question that was rooted in the application of eugenic principles, leading to the systematic and industrialized genocide of 6 million people. Right? So this was what happened in Europe. And actually not only that, but also small scales of massacres in different colonies, for example, for example, like British colonies. Okay. And like in East Africa, that was still colonized by the British Empire. In the 1950s, some other tragedies also occurred. What happened now in Taiwan during the war then? So we see that the body from 1920s on, the measurement of human parts did not only emphasize on skulls, but also different body parts. And there was a very strong purpose to strengthen the body constitution of so-called the Japanese Minsoku, right? And so this is in Taiwan from 1938. This was a case study I'm now looking at. Is that in summer, that some weak children, they were selected from different schools, and then because they were lighter, they were thinner, and these teachers think that their body constitution, they were perhaps they need more nutrition, they need more exercise, and they need to eat more. So they gather these students from different elementary schools, and to train them to strengthen to sing songs, to do a lot of activities, right, and to train their creativity, and also to feed them with more nutritious food. And then, but I would have to say that because the science was still not that scientifically sound, the only way for them to measure whether or not their body constitution was improved or not was to weigh their weight only, right? After the summer camp, they weigh their weight. They're 2 kilograms heavier than before. Then we say that this camp is functioning, right? And then this kind of science, measuring all different body parts among school children, the practice was carried forward toward to the post-war period in Taiwan and in Japan as well. This is all the activities they were doing, right? And so these are just a case study I am looking at to see how racial characteristics, racial qualities can be constructed by inter-imperial networks, right? Just through a very tiny case study, right? I roughly map out the genealogy. What genealogy means is it means how knowledge can be passed on, right? So the genealogy of physical anthropologies in Japanese East Asia through inter-imperial networks in the first half of the 20th century. I have not included China because in China, that's a very different story. So I have shown that the theories with similar origins could be developed into different discourses and practices for different scientific and political purposes. And the development of these theories and practices of physical anthropology in East Asia was not simply a story of diffusion, okay? So I have demonstrated that instead, it was a zigzag process. And those who were considered as receivers did not just passively accept things. They became, for example, like a generator of knowledge as well. In Taiwan, it used to receive so-called the medical theories that was created for the purpose of colonization. During the wartime, Taiwan became a base for the Japanese Empire to embark, to really send out scientists for further surveys in Southeast Asia. So this is one of the examples. So nowadays, back to the Four Skulls story, right? Now, the repatriation of body parts collection to museums has become a global trend. Now, it is urgent for us, historians of science, to look into the past and expose the injustice of how these so-called specimens were obtained, possessed, and studied by different individuals. And more importantly, what we haven't really heard in these stories is about the voices of victims themselves. They had no chance to really voice for themselves and to speak or to stand up for themselves, right? And how they became unfortunate victims in different battles and in different scientific studies, right? We need their voice. This is urgent and pressing. Okay, so this study, a lot of stories are rather sporadic, but I hope that you still can learn something from these cases. And let's discuss things if you have questions. Okay. I think we have 40 minutes or so.
Well, I'll try to be the warm-up person to
Okay.
ask question before the students. It's a very fascinating and interesting case, and also the historical context. It's also very rich. But I was wondering, at the end of your lecture, you mentioned that the victims' voices are badly needed for this history. So, as a historian, how are you going to get access to this kind of voices, and what might be the possibilities, and where are you going to look for them?
Yeah.
If that's so important and critical.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I mean, in Taiwan, nowadays, if you want to study, for example, like the we call the human data obtained from indigenous people, right? First of all, we need people's consent, right? And when we establish ethical principles, we need to go through a committee's ethical review the internal review board of ethics, and the committee composition need to include indigenous people or those who are studied, those communities and individuals who are the target groups of the research, right? This is the first step. And then there are, for example, I think in Australia, they have established principles about if you want to publish scientific reports based on, for example, like these specimens, human parts obtained from unjust, from unjust method, then you need to include at least a section discussing about the stories of these specimens. Right? There was a principle like this. And in Taiwan, I think we're going in a rather different direction, which I think can be improved, because nowadays, if you want to study human samples obtained from indigenous communities, the hurdles become very high. It is almost impossible nowadays to do this kind of research because in the internal review board would basically reject your request, a very high proportion of your requests, right? This is not healthy, and this is not helpful for the development of science. So for me, now, if you include a story about how these specimens were sourced or obtained or possessed, I think that this is a better way of conducting such research then.
Well, I think that's a very good reminder, but I'm curious, going back to history, when we do history and when we tell a story, the sources we can get access are usually from, the colonizers'
Yeah.
archives. It's very hard to find so-called the victim side of the story.
That's right.
So I'm curious, because this is a historical study. So how are you going to find the voices of the colonized people?
We can't. So the only thing that we can do is to critically reflect on the wrongdoing, of all these scientific methods and process that nowadays are perceived as unjust. I think this is the only way, right? And then perhaps you can include one section of discussion about how such past can be perceived by nowadays, the indigenous communities, right, in the discussion, to include living people's opinions, right? And I think this is a way of practicing so-called narrative ethics in producing such historical research. To write as a historian, you still can practice narrative ethics, right, at the same time.
Okay, so it's an indirect way of addressing the issue of, not being able to have the voices
Yeah,
of, the colonized or the victims.
that's
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a great reminder because as a historian, we interpret the past, but we need to recognize that we still have limitation. We are not fully capable, and we're not 100% right, right?
All right. So now I hope my question warm up and the discussion was stimulating enough for you guys, for the students, or if there are any faculties online. You are all
Yes.
welcome to ask questions. Yes, please.
Good morning.
I'm so glad you are in this class.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. So,
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, so my name is Nuran. Doing my PhD in University of Tiscoba, mainly in neuroscience and sleep medicine. Basically, I'm from Egypt, so actually, I was always interested in how ancient Egyptian mummies can be used as a genetic source to study ancient human history and so on. But today, actually, by attending this impressive lecture, so I started to think about how epigenetics could be amplified in applied anthropology. So yeah, so I always was like only focusing on genetic sources in anthropology and so on, but now by like going through this presentation, I started to think about, so what will be the epigenetics,
Yeah.
how this could be like integrated with the applied anthropology and study human history and so on.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, great reflection. I think this is more like a reflection rather than a question, right? Because well, for these four Bolton skulls nowadays, they are now stored in a museum, 3 hours away from where the Paiwan, uh, the four warriors were killed. Now, it was they were trying to answer local people's question whether or not the four skulls belong to themselves or belong to their community by studying their genes. Whether or not this is whether genetic science or epigenetic science, there are not final clues for who these people are. Right? We need to bear in mind, or look from from the era of phrenology to physical anthropology to craniology to anthropometry to nowadays to genetic science and or epigenetic science. They are all clues for who we are, but they are not the full data, right? And so we form our community by not only by a lot of different things, by the way we do with it, by also language, right? By our behaviors as well, right? So these are all important message in our bodies, but there are also other elements that we have to look at, and we need to carefully study them and to constantly critically scrutinize them and then constantly reflect on in such process, in such approach, what our limitations are. Right? So this is what this story can tell us about in terms of doing modern research, I think.
So is that difficult to study how the migration or psychosocial or even nutritional stress could affect the anthropology for what we will study? Is that difficult compared to the only the genetic makeup that we can just like
Well,
collect them and just analyze them and get those huge data of genes?
of course, it's not easy, and then I get you need teamworks. I mean, there are a lot of different teams in the world. There are international collaborative laboratories. They are trying to use, for example, they study how people migrate by really examining the the mitochondrial genetic profiles of different people, different remains available in, for example, like in Austronesian islands. I guess there are a lot of teams doing this kind of job, and the team should basically they are interdisciplinary. They're just not genetic scientists. They are also linguists. They're archaeologists. They're historians, right? And of course, the most importantly, you need the voice of people you are studying.
Yeah, right. Thank you for your great presentation, actually. Thank you. Thank you for your efforts as well. Thank you.
And for example, this
Questions?
last slide, sorry.
Go ahead. I was
Yeah.
going to try to encourage students
Right.
to speak up more. Oh yeah, we got one here.
Okay.
Bokan
Hi.
Chen. Yes, please. Please.
Your
You
microphone
need to
is not
turn on
on.
your microphone. Yes.
I'm a student from NCKU and I have one question. And it says the think of some you have a question in hierarchy classification. And you say in previous study, Japanese won't will classify the different people in their minzoku,
Yeah.
but they will not create hierarchy. But in Nazi in Nazi German rule, the European times, they will use hierarchy to massacre the Jews. And what do you think this transformation was made?
All right. Okay. So it was a political purpose, right? As the infrastructure of science, for example, like in Japan, that it was now, if you are familiar with the history of Taiwan, now in the from the 1930s to the so-called the transfer period of Taiwan, there was called the Nanshinron theory period that the Japan wanted to expand its territory as an empire, right? But it also wanted to kind of that such development were developed in contrast with Euro-American empires. They wanted to show, to demonstrate that the empire was benign, right? Was not like brutal British or German empires that kill people everywhere, right? And so they tended to create this great whole East Asian prosperity sphere, right? Having said that, I also had to say that there were also a lot of killings, brutal killings under this framework. So nothing is absolute. Nothing is absolute. It's just comparatively that the science developed under this framework, that the hierarchy or the superiority or inferiority of human races were not that much emphasized, right? Okay, so this was the political end that supports the development of science, right? And also like in Nazi Germany, that they wanted to really that the German Nazis wanted to eliminate a certain inferior race that they thought they were poorer in their genetic pools, right? So they wanted to eliminate certain the Jewish people, right? And all these sciences were just, unfortunately, victims. They were just employed to serve these people, interested people's political purposes. Right? Do I answer your question?
Yeah, very clear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think I interrupted you before you were going to say something, Harry.
Right.
Would you like to finish that, what you were going to say?
Yeah, thank you. So this slide I stopped at, this is not an image related to the four Bolton skulls. This is actually a ceremony that was conducted recently, I guess maybe 3 or 4 years ago, in at National Taiwan University's medical school, right? So in the 1960s, still that the physical anthropology laboratory at NTU Medical School, they borrowed actually 60 something skeletons from this tribe in Hualien, Mayuan Bulo, right? And they wanted to study their body characteristics, right? And after, I guess, more than 50 years, that they are trying to return these skulls, but they found that there were just 40 something boxes that were returned. So more than 10 skeletons were missing. And so people from this tribe were very angry. They kind of they had a protest and they walked on the street accusing the university and the hospital actually of mishandling these samples. So you can see that now after the Second World War, now it's actually very close to our period, right? Our time. Now people are doing sound scientific, they think sound scientific method research, but we are not respecting our study subjects enough, right? So see, all these practices were left behind by the unjust in the science previously existed.
Yeah, so kind of one of those dark histories in history of science and medicine.
Yeah, and actually, for example, the physical anthropology laboratory that was so crucial and important in this story that it's got a lot of human specimens, and now they're still confined in the basement of the lab. And it has become a taboo nowadays when people are were trying to really open up and to retell the story. And in my opinion, is that this is crucial. Actually, we need to. It is better really to reveal all these stories rather than to confine these stories in the dark room, and so that we have a better chance to understand ourselves. And this returning 4 Bolton skulls is the first step to open the door. Right?
I'm waiting for more students to ask questions before I ask mine because I have so many questions.
Okay.
This is such an interesting topic. Okay, I will ask mine again.
Sure.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk, you say that at the beginning, initially, these Taiwan people, they were not sure if, what they were going to do with all these skulls that were going to be returned by Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And they were waiting, they tried to use science. They did a DNA analysis
Yeah.
to decide whether or not these were actually belong to their ancestors. So I was wondering, if along with these skulls, there were some documents or archives that, as you use some of them, right? The story you told, obviously,
Yeah.
based on some of the archival records. So why is it, what's your thought about this? Why is it documents were not enough and they need this kind of very up-to-date modern scientific method to determine or to ensure that that is, these skulls are actually from their own people, you know.
Yeah.
You know,
It can be my
I
question
thought that
as
was
well.
kind of ironic. Yeah.
Yeah, so all these, for example, human artifacts are not available anymore, right? It was only the remains, the skulls that were there, right? So it's very unfortunate that I can only construct the story with all indirect evidence, right? Yeah. And so maybe it says something about in such science, it was the skulls, the bones themselves that were under attended, the people are attended to, right? Not other things.
Mhm.
But it's very interesting that when they were conducting the ceremony, that they had to decide a date for the four scouts to be taken on board to be flown to Taiwan, and they need to go through a lot of rituals. They need to determine the date. They need to, for example, they ask the ancestral spirit first to determine the date, and then also they had to keep everything low profile. And the reason was something that most of us cannot really think of, imagine, is that if they revealed the date when the ritual was going to be carried out, and then Chinese people, I mean Chinese, will interfere because they will claim that these four skulls were from Qing Dynasty, and Qing Dynasty was part of China. And then so there was a likelihood that the four skulls won't be returned to Taiwan, but to China. Right. So
Wow.
yeah, so they had to keep everything in low profile. See, so nowadays it's still it's still in great controversy.
Mhm. But speaking about the Chinese reaction, have you come across any of the comments from the Chinese side regarding this event?
Oh,
Did
not
they say anything, like they try to claim the ownership of these skulls? I thought if they try, that would make them look really bad.
who
'Cause,
knows, right?
I don't know.
Who
Yeah.
knows? I don't know. I didn't see anything, but because they actually
Uh-huh.
confined the plan so carefully, and
Mm.
right after the ritual was conducted, there were reports uh, appearing in the Guardians, the BBC, or major media, and I think that was their strategy to actually to make everything under the sun at the same time. Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. When Nora asked question, and you're from Egypt, I was curious. I thought you might be. I think they in the as far as I can remember, there were a few cases about the British Museum had uh, kept some artifacts from Egypt, right? And then there were some disputes, but I can't quite remember the details. And these kind of instances are pretty, people are curious about it, and it caused lots of controversies. And I was wondering if you could remember any of these and then make a comparison with this the Taiwan case from Taiwan. I mean, Egypt in terms of geopolitics is very different from Taiwan, right? So one would assume that this kind of disputes would be carried out in a very different way. Um, I don't know. Maybe Harry knows, but I'm
I can
curious
of
about.
course say something, right? So the argument, for
That's
example,
the next.
yeah,
Mhm.
sure, okay.
Yeah, maybe Nora wanna say first, and then we will have Harry.
Yeah, actually, yeah, as you said, sure, yeah. So there are a lot of Egyptian mummies in UK museums, actually. As far as I know now, in Egypt, we started to have like a lot of um, mm, genetic testing to analyze how the like the how an ancient Egyptian mummies genome could suggest the relation between sub-Saharan African ancestry in real words. So to do this, or to go for those analysis, so we need yeah, as much as we can, like genetic resource from a lot of Egyptian mummies. So, and at the end, this will like guide us to how can I say it, to have those at least those Egyptian mummies to be back to Egypt. And like from uh 3 years, or like, yeah, and the last years as well, there was like many calls from Egypt to UK to just ask them for this kind of collaboration to get those ancient things, or even mummies back, to be back to Egypt, or at least to have like a collaboration by collecting, sampling, and those things to help in those kind of analysis. So yeah.
Right.
Mm.
Okay,
And
so Harry, would you like to comment?
yeah,
That?
what I'm going to say is that previously, the reason why the British Museum argued that these artifacts that they sourced from worldwide during the empire expansion, right, it was better to be kept in the museum because all these other places they claim, for including Egypt, was not politically stable, right? And if all these these artifacts were stored, was kept in Egypt, perhaps they will be destructed, or there will be, yeah, something. Well, some people was steal these artifacts. One, we don't know, right? But recently, what happened in the British Museum, there were several scandals, right, about some artifacts are not well kept. And last year, there was even a scandal. One of the curators that he stole some artifacts, and these artifacts they emerged. They appeared in black markets in the UK,
Wow.
right? And so the museum immediately fired this curator, and that also was a critical moment when the repatriation movement kind of, well, uh, became a sensation worldwide. And now it became a moment for a lot of people to say, to really to ask for repatriation for their own national treasures, right? So this is at the moment I'm predicting that there will be more and more artifacts being repatriated, right? Right. And also, this is a chance, really, for example, like the case of Taiwan, is for us to really enhance, to upskill our our museum services, right? So in Taiwan, museums are often regarded as these public sectors and full of the civil servants who are not really doing things at all, right? So we need more researchers, we need more scientists, and these scientists should be better paid, and to take care of all these precious subjects we have. And so this is the critical moment.
So, speaking of this, do the Taiwan people, they actually agree that the museum is the appropriate place for these skulls, or would they prefer a proper bureau?
Yeah.
I don't know. The Taiwan culture. What do they do with their dead? Do they consider it's better to, like the Han ethnic Han people in Taiwan would probably prefer a bureau, just um
Yeah.
maybe cremated or buried underground. What do they think?
Um, if it is a good, if it is good death, that means you did not really die from misfortune. For Paiwan communities, they bury their ancestors at home, and people would squat, but it's not really they did not lie down, they squat, and then underneath the most important underneath your home actually, right? And in the area in your household that resembles nowadays we call it the living room. Right? So that's where people sleep, right, after they die. And so for this case, is that there are different voices among the Paiwan community. And some people say that because they die from misfortune, they were killed. You can clearly see that on the four skulls, and there were injuries created by weapons, clearly obvious created by weapons. And some people would say that these are because they die because of the very brutal killing. They were not blessed ancestors at all, right? So in order to, well, the you need Gaga's voice. Well, not really Gaga's, the spirit, because Gaga is Taya, right? You need the ancestors, the spirit, an approval, right? For them to be buried uh, at home, right? But in modern, this is something tricky that in modern times there were not these kind of sites for proper burials at all. So perhaps the museum is a better way to keep the skulls, right? And nowadays in Taiwan culture, people are also practicing cremation rather than burials, right? And so this is highly contested.
Yes, yes. Wow. So
Um,
interesting.
Yeah, I want to also comment regarding something. So yeah, when the British museums say that okay, they will keep those artifacts as they will not be that say safe in Egypt, but actually recently last year we had two modern highly technology museums in Egypt. One of them is Egyptian Civilization Museum, and the other one is the Grand Egyptian Museum. And actually, those museums are like they are highly in a technological way. So that's why recently and last year Egyptians call the British Museum to return one of the most important artifact, which is Rosetta Stone. This is stone that actually is important to Egypt, and we need this part to like together this stone with other stones that we have in Egypt to fulfill a lot of historical stories or facts in Egypt in old Egyptian. So yeah, so
Yeah.
trying yeah.
So like in Bolton's case, is that the University Edinburgh, they wanted to know whether or not the museum in Taiwan
Mhm,
also has the same condition to really to keep the specimens well, that they
mhm.
were willing to return, yeah, to see that the conditions are compatible, right? And so that they are willing to return the skulls.
Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think we have the same. Yeah, right.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. Any students? Any bold students want to speak up?
I would take this. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Actually, this is not naive at all. It's very important. I mean, as a historian, how we tell our stories just is to write really long articles, right? And so these really long articles are not necessarily available. They need to be downloaded, and then they were also behind a very high hurdle or paywall. And then, uh, but for us, this is the best way really to convey our ideas in detail in a very nuanced, very way to carefully discuss every single point we want to raise. And for example, we can't miss out, and we want to make our points very critical so that we create very long argument. But in order to reveal this history, I mean, this history, the story should be known by the public, by the members of the public. So museum perhaps is one strategy, is one media. Where a website is one media, but all for the museum or for the website, curation itself is highly, highly political. When you are presenting something, are you able to really convey every single detail point that is respective of uh, different people's opinions in such a long paragraph? No, short paragraph, right, of words. Right. This is highly technical, right? And you need to take care of different people. You need to be able to not only to celebrate the glory of people you are writing, also to commemorate those who fell misunfortunate, to fell into the misfortune, and or to really to take care of the emotions, the feelings of their descendants. That's highly skillful business, right? So for us, for this story, what I'm going to do is to write a very long article, right? Before I can think of making it more public through other media. Now, this is my answer.
I think for a museum to have a very good exhibition, to be able to do that, I think it has to have um, really, really good research to be its foundation.
Yeah, true.
So that's yeah, I think so. Harry is doing very important work, just to really, really get into the historical details and really understand it deeply. So we won't, if you go to a museum, you could see really, if you pay attention, you will see that the qualities of the exhibition and how much and how deep you could really understand what's on display. Really, if they are based on really good research, you will really get more, as opposed to those who just have a bunch of artifacts there, but really had little interpretation or analysis of what actually the object was, what kind of object was produced. originated. So I think we do appreciate the kind of research for a good exhibition to be possible. Yeah.
Right. And it's also very important. I mean, in writing a historical research, for example, that these although I said that the sciences, there were pseudoscience and there were unjust practices in the past, but they were just perceived by people nowadays. In the past, just like what I said in my presentation, the exchange as gifts of these specimens were very, very common practice among scientists. So we are not really discrediting what they were doing, right? We just have to argue things historically to see how nowadays we do things have become differently. Yeah, differently, right? So this is another way of emphasizing a sound and detailed historical research is how important it is.
All right, we have 2 minutes. If nobody jumps in, I will just say we can take a break now and we'll come back at 10:10 for our next lecture. Is that all right? Okay, well, let's thank Harry for his wonderful and really, really fascinating lecture. And hopefully in a year or two, he's a fast writer, that we will see this product of this research and we'll share it with everyone. I think it's really fascinating. All right, okay, so let's take a break. Thank you, Harry.
You're welcome, and thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone. We'll be back.